to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. In this podcast, Lance Izumi, PRI Senior Director of our Center for Education, chats with Larry Sand, President of the California Teachers Empowerment Network, during National School Choice Week in January. They discuss the school choice movement and the progress they've made to date, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court case Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. The case focuses on the constitutionality of the so-called Blaine amendments, which prohibits public funding of schools with a religious affiliation. California is among many states that has a Blaine amendment law, so the court's decision will have important implications for school choice here in our state. Thanks for joining us.
As a former teacher who's worked for many years in the Los Angeles School District, could you give us your thoughts on why school choice is so important for parents and children?
Yes, it is very important, as you say, Lance, and thank you for having me. I think about what Eric Hanushek said many years ago. He's a scholar at Stanford, and he talked about if we get rid of the bottom 5 to 7% of teachers, we could probably have a world-class education system. Now, what that means in California, we're talking about 300,000 teachers and 5 to 7%. If we take Hanushek's middle number of 6% of 300,000 teachers is 18,000 teachers. If each one of those 18,000 teachers has 25 kids in a class, that's 450,000 students every year who are getting a subpar or worse education, and that is not acceptable. It's so interesting. In my storied career, one thing I learned is that everybody knows who the bad teachers are. The kids know, the teachers know, the parents know, the principal knows, the janitor knows. When janitor goes into a room at the end of the day and the room and the chairs are hanging outside the window, he knows there's a bad teacher who has no control. And of course, I taught with so many wonderful teachers, and most teachers got the job done. They were adequate. But there were always 4 or 5 who never should have been there, and due to union tenure or permanence rules, they got to keep their jobs. And I think back to, let's call her Miss L. She was a humorless crank who regularly abused children verbally. And dare I say, she decided to, one day she wanted to get a suntan and went out on the athletic field topless. And
oh my gosh!
And she was remiss, but and that and the fact that she was a horrible teacher she should be doing something else. But she just got put in another school. And then Mr. H was a nice old man, but he had no control. His classes looked like the late stages of a British soccer riot. I would walk in there and just wait to be hit with something. And when I was testing coordinator, I had to visit all the rooms. And he couldn't be fired. And then there was Mr. F, who was the PE teacher. And he had a very interesting ritual. We had 6 minutes between classes, and he would go to his trunk of his car where he had an elaborate bar set up. And he would, between classes, and I mean every class, take a few swigs and then return to the job. By the end of the day, the man was pickled.
Oh,
he was toasted, his face was red, his eyes were glazed. He never got fired. I want to keep children away from teachers like that, and school choice will work toward that end. And also, I mean, in addition to subpar teachers, we have political indoctrination. This is not acceptable.
I mean, any one of them by themselves would be reason for school choice. And you put them all together, and it makes for, a really crucial case that we need to change how things are done with regard to how we deliver education services to kids. So there's a potentially landmark school choice case actually in front of the United States Supreme Court now, and that case is Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. Now, I personally have just written an op-ed piece on this case which focuses on the constitutionality of the so-called Blaine amendments. Could you give us a rundown on what the Espinoza case is all about and what the constitutional issues there are at stake in the case?
Well, very basically, in December of 2018, the Montana Supreme Court struck down the state's tax credit program that allowed poor kids to use donated pre-tax money to attend private schools, including religious ones. Very simply, tax credit scholarships allow taxpayers to receive full or partial tax credits when they donate to nonprofits that provide private school scholarships for kids. Currently, 250,000 kids nationwide benefit from private school choice through education tax credits. The Montana program provided a dollar-for-dollar tax credit up to $150, not very much, matching an individual's or a corporation's donations to nonprofit student scholarship organizations. But according to the state court, it allowed the legislature to indirectly pay tuition at private, religiously affiliated schools. Heavens. And this is contrary to Montana law. And As you know, Lance, the ruling comes to us courtesy of the Blaine Amendment, the Montana Blaine Amendment, which is very simply an anti-Catholic law, a variety of which exists in 36 other states and is supported heartily by the education establishment, notably the teachers' unions. By the mid-19th century, most of America's private schools were Catholic, a minority part of the population, while public schools were actually Protestant schools. And the battle lines over religion in education were drawn then, and they're still with us, unfortunately. The good news is that on January 22nd, the Supreme Court justices held oral arguments in Espinoza case, and hopefully this will overturn the Montana court's ruling. And in two other similar cases, the Supreme Court has come down on the side of religious freedom. And in the 2002 Zellman versus Simmons-Harris decision, SCOTUS ruled that because financial aid goes to parents and not the religious school, vouchers are indeed constitutional. And then in 2017's Trinity Lutheran Church versus Pauley, a Missouri church that was operating a daycare and preschool, applied for a state grant program that helps nonprofits pay to install rubber playground services. The state denied the church's application because, quote, the state constitution bars the state from providing funds to religious entities, end quote. But Trinity Lutheran pursued the case all the way to the Supreme Court, where it prevailed. The national ramifications, well, with the Espinoza case, SCOTUS can once and for all get rid of the anti-God-based religious laws that unfortunately still permeate our country.
No, I'm absolutely right. I mean, I think what's interesting from what I've heard is that in the oral arguments during the case, that of course the conservative justices were very direct in their questioning of the Montana state attorney who was representing Montana. However, I understand that Justice Breyer, part of the liberal bloc, was actually almost as pointed in his questioning of the Montana representatives. So, which indicates that there might be a larger majority if they decide to rule against the Blaine amendments. There might be a larger majority for doing that.
Well, you're right about Breyer, and I read a fair amount about the oral arguments, but it seems that Roberts was giving very mixed signals, as usual. Mm-hmm. We don't know how he's going to come down. I dare say it's going to be a close vote. It
may be a 5-4 vote, but with a different configuration of who those five are.
Yes, you're right. Breyer could be one of the five, mm-hmm. and Roberts one of the four.
Mm-hmm. So, well, a couple of sections of the California state constitution have Blaine Amendment languages. So, I mean, let's just say for the sake of argument that the Supreme Court strikes down the 37 state Blaine amendments that are currently in operation right now, including California's. What do you think that would be the impact on the potential for, let's say, greater school choice in our state?
Well, in our state, it's always going to be a very tough sell because, I'm sure you know, the California Teachers Association is the biggest, basically runs the state, in my opinion. It would certainly, from a legal standpoint, it would make things much easier. But still, then there's the whole political part of it, and it would still be a very hard sell. It would have to be undoubtedly an initiative. I don't think, at least probably not in my lifetime, will the people over in the Capitol building go for it. So it would probably have to come from the people.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, speaking of initiatives then, Larry, I mean, you recently spoke at a rally for a proposed school choice initiative. Could you just give us a preview of this initiative, what its main elements are, and, your thoughts on, the possibility of passage?
We're going to try for 2022. And it's a very innovative K-16 plan which would allow savings achieved by attending home charter or private schools to be rolled into an account to help pay for college tuition. It's a wonderful idea. So basically, if a parent, let's say, decides to send their kid to a private school for K through 12, that's 13 years. If they can save $5,000 a year, which is what you can do by sending your kid to a private school, that means they've saved the state $65,000. That $65,000 would be rolled into college tuition for the parent's child. Now, it's a wonderful idea because it would promote competition, which raises all boats. Children would be getting a better education. The taxpayer would not be out a dime, more than they are now, and college debt would become a thing of the past, but you wouldn't hear quite so much about it because parents would have more money to pay for their children's education post high school. And the good news is that choice is becoming more popular with the people. It's popular across political lines because liberal parents, inner city parents like the idea. So granted, it's a long shot. I mean, for reasons we've just discussed, getting anything done here is a long shot, but it's an innovative plan, and I'm going to do what I can to get this on the ballot, and hopefully, who knows.
And you've mentioned that school choice is popular across the board, both nationwide and even here in California. And you've written, of course, many articles on school choice, but one of the things you've always pointed out is the polling data. Shows that school choice is a very popular idea, even in a blue state like California. I mean, mention like some of the polling data recently that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be between 68 and 70% are in favor of school choice. And what's interesting. It's very similar across all demographics. Whites, blacks, Hispanics, millennials are all in that 68 to 70% range. That said, it's going to take a lot more than polling to get this thing done because, once again, as I brought up earlier, it's the political angle, and you're going to have if this any kind of choice is going to happen here, it's going to happen the old-fashioned way. You're going to have people knocking on doors, raising money. We need to emphasize that minorities will be the big winners here. We need to go into churches and talk about this, civic meetings. It needs to be stressed this is not a right-left issue. It's a parent empowerment issue. It's an educational freedom issue. And, the downside is, of course, CTA, the California Teachers Association, which is not shy about spending money on political issues, will spend every last penny it has on this. And when they run out of money, they'll go to Big Daddy, National Education Association, and get more. So it's not going to be easy, but we're going to try it.
Speaking of the teachers union, CTA in particular, tell us a little bit for those of our listeners who may not be aware of the power of the CTA and also like what type of force they've been in previous school choice initiatives that have been on the ballot. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, there are two previous initiatives, I believe, 1993 and 2000. I think it was 2000.
Around there.
Yeah, and interestingly, they both went down badly. They both went down 70 to 30, almost the exact same percentages in both cases. And CTA led the charge. I don't remember at this point how much they spent, but they spent a lot, and they will keep spending to do this. All I'll say is we live in a different time now. The last measure was, I think, Tim Draper's measure, and he was a wealthy guy, and he spent a lot of money, but he still couldn't outdo CTA. But I think we live in different times now. People know a little bit more about school choice, are more amenable to considering it.
Well, one of the things that I've always thought, as an observer looking at some of these previous school choice initiatives is that oftentimes, you had some like Mr. Draper, who was the father of the last choice initiative. But, it was a lot of top-down, hoping that, if you spent a lot of money that you could, pass an initiative. To me, it always seemed like you needed a ground-up model where you had a lot of grassroots support and then, of course, have the resources in addition to that. But if you didn't have that grassroots support, the initiative wasn't going to go anywhere.
That's a very good point. And as I said, minorities are going to have to get involved and talk in the churches, explain what school choice is, because school choice, the educational establishment always talks about they're siphoning our funds and it weakens public education, and it doesn't weaken public education. School choice, it makes public education better because competition makes us all better.
Oh, that's right. So going forward, what do you see as the future for school choice in America, and maybe specifically here in California, especially in view of the continuing improvement in things such as education technology, the rise of homeschooling, and the success of state school choice programs such as those, for example, in Florida, where you have Governor DeSantis, who was elected in 2018 by a very narrow margin, but now is one of the most popular governors in the entire country, partly because of his focus on expanding school choice in a state which already has a fair amount of school choice.
Right. Well, I certainly think, especially if the Montana case is successful in the Supreme Court, that we'll see more efforts nationwide because people will be buoyed by the decision and be more likely to, hey, we can do this type of thing. But once again, in California, not to be a dreary Doris, but it's going to take a lot to get us there. Bob Bowden of Choice Media once used an interesting metaphor. He said the school choice in this country is like a huge steamship. It took a long time, but it's now pointing in the right direction, but it just moves very slowly. And every year when you look at the statistics, there's more and more programs, more and more states, more and more kids, but we're still way behind where we should be. We need universal choice everywhere, and we're not there. So, is the cup of water half full, half empty? I don't know.
Well, I mean, one of the things that, in my view, is that, especially in a place like California, where, of course, we've had a very strong and vibrant charter school movement for many years, but because last year the legislature and the governor enacted a law that would basically put the brakes on the expansion of charter schools here. Seems to me that, the real future, at least in terms of expansion in school choice, may actually be in homeschooling because, homeschooling still, there hasn't been a lot of roadblocks put up against homeschooling yet. You've seen the increase in America generally of from about 1 million homeschoolers 20 years ago to about 2 million today. And you have in California about 250,000 students who are being homeschooled. And so with this improvement in ed technology, online curriculum, all those sorts of things that make it much easier for parents to be able to homeschool their kids, and because it prevents their kids from being indoctrinated in the government schools, I think there's going to be a greater incentive for parents to start looking at homeschool options.
Absolutely. When I speak publicly, I always say that the best option is to homeschool your kids. You know exactly where they are, what they're doing, what they're learning, what they're not learning. And as you point out, with online resources, because let's say a parent might not be real whippy at algebra, well, you can go online. There are also homeschool co-ops where maybe one parent is really great at math and another parent's really great at English, so you almost have like a middle school situation where you go into different homes for different subjects. And it's, that's really the way to go, in my opinion. Of course, there are issues if a woman or a man is a single parent and they have to work. Homeschooling is obviously difficult. But if you live in a two-parent home, you can swing it.
I also think, too, even in the cases of single parents, for example, you have now resources such as charter schools that actually cater to homeschoolers so that you can actually send your homeschool child to a charter school for maybe a couple days a week or something like that. It creates a lot more flexibility in terms of schedule for the parents than having to always be the one-on-one with your child 5 days a week, for example. And so to me, that type of flexibility that all these different resources are giving these parents are making it easier, even for single parents. And one of the things that I should mention, too, is that in my own work, one of my upcoming new book is going to actually focus on a homeschooled girl who has severe disabilities, learning disabilities. And I think that's another untold story, that we think that homeschooling is not for kids like that, when actually it turns out there's a lot of movement of parents who with kids with special needs to homeschooling because they're not getting the type of educational services in the one-size-fits-all conventional schools.
I agree. And once again, I cannot speak more highly of homeschooling. I think one of the problems is convincing parents that they can do it, because so many parents, I don't have a teaching credential. How could I? They just, my God, you cook for your kids, your kid gets sick, you take care of them. It's not that hard to teach somebody 2 and 2 is 4 and how to put a sentence together. You don't have to be a credentialed teacher to do that. And don't get me started on teaching credentials.
Yeah, well, I agree with you.
That's a whole other show.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and I think that, and the last thing I would mention is that in this new book of mine, which tentatively is called Mia's Journey. It's about this girl, Mia Giordano. She's co-authoring the book with me. Her mom, was actually asked by a lot of other parents, gosh, how do you do this? Good. And I mean, because going to your point about because other parents are sort of afraid that I'm not sure if I can be the one to teach my child. Yet, here's this parent of a special needs child who took on that challenge, and she's done extremely well. So with that, I want to thank Larry Sand for being our guest here today. And Larry, if people really want to follow your work closely, how can they, what are the best ways to do that?
Okay, I blog regularly for the California Policy Center pretty much every week. Occasionally I write for City Journal, op-eds. I run an entity called the California Teachers Empowerment Network, which gets information to teachers that they don't get in other places. And the website is c10home.org. That's CTENHOME.org.
That's great. Well, again, our guest, Larry Sand, terrific having you, Larry.
Thank you, Lance. A pleasure.
Special thanks to Larry Sand and to Lance Izumi. For more information on the California Teachers Empowerment Network, visit ctenhome.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. I hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.